All right, returning to the National Assembly passing the Gender-Based Violence and Femicide Bill. So this is a bill now likely to become law, and it makes provision for a national council to look at a strategy around GBV. We're joined again by Lisa Vetten, research specialist on gender-based violence. Let's try again, Lisa. Why does a council make a big difference?
Well, the council has three functions. One is to be advisory towards the Minister of Women, Children and Youth and People with Disabilities, is to explain or identify what they should be doing or what should be pushed in government. The second is a coordinating role, and that I think can be very helpful because you often have a situation where one government department is doing exactly the same thing as another, but neither is speaking to each other, and in fact they might sometimes even be in direct competition with each other over their programs. So that's also really important, those coordination advisory roles. And it's also up to them to identify what are the priorities and to make sure that the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide is implemented. I think what's also helpful is that the council has tried to imagine itself as existing at multiple levels. So while you have a national council, you also have structures replicated at provincial and local level. And that's really important because it means that I think decisions and priorities can also be determined locally. They're not made far away by people in a national office. So I think those are some of the strengths that do exist in the council. Okay,
so a lot of coordination, and you have one body, and you said the different regions working together. Explain how it'll work. So there is civil society participation. How are people selected to this board? What is their term? Give us some of the nitty-gritty details.
Okay, so there will be 15 members of the board, 7 chosen from government departments and 8 by civil society. So I think that's an attempt to try to make sure, well, there is government representation. It's not necessarily driven by government. And so you also have your chair being drawn from civil society as well as government. So that's an attempt to also try and balance the powers to some extent. For civil society, this will be a nomination process, and that still seems to need to be worked out. The Act at this point says it needs to be taken from civil society as well as the private sector. So there will also be, I think, that point of bringing in business as well, which is, I think, which is an unusual step and a first. I think the concern in relation to the council is that it doesn't have particularly strong teeth. And that is not necessarily a fault of the legislation or the thinking behind the council. It's the fact that any structure within government finds it incredibly difficult, and in fact usually cannot, hold another government structure to account. That role is typically fulfilled by Parliament, and you could potentially also be pulling in the Commission for Gender Equality to play some of that role. But the questions of how one gets government to implement, I think, are not going to necessarily be solved by a council. A council will help, but I think we have to take into account the fact that government is not doing particularly well at the moment. And a council overseeing and coordinating is not necessarily going to improve, for example, the police's ability to investigate rape cases, for instance. I mean, there's already been a few structures that have been trying to keep the National Strategic Plan on track and trying to ensure that things are implemented, that coordination is happening, and it hasn't necessarily been able to bring about this massive turnaround that we'd like to see. But that, I think, is a feature of some of the difficulties within government right now.
All right, so the National Council, just one of the pieces in the puzzle, and women and children are still subject to so much in South Africa, but at least that being welcome that it has now passed through. That was Lisa Vetten, a research specialist on gender-based violence.